First program this morning is a legislative update from Ms. Sarah Kirkle, who is the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs at TWCA. You can see her full bio and all the bios of all the speakers in the event program that can be accessed through the website. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Sarah to the Texas Groundwater Summit, her first of many. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for that introduction, Zach. As long as we can see my screen all right, I'll hop in here and start talking about the legislature. So, this morning I thought I'd talk a little bit about the uncertainty of COVID and what that has meant for us, especially during the interim activity so far, and then how that might relate into what we can expect next session. So right now, the state capitol is still closed. It closed earlier this summer after a lot of buildings were closed because of COVID, and committees have not had the chance to meet because outside of the capitol, it's really difficult for them because of COVID infection risks, facility capacity limits, gathering limits, and other restrictions that we have in state and local orders. House and Senate rules also don't provide for video conference hearings or testimony. And because we're not in session, we can't make changes to those rules, right? Only the governor can call us into session, and that was the only way that we'd be able to amend those rules. So staff are still working very hard. It just hasn't been as much public interaction as we typically see in an interim. As a result, there's not been as much legislative activity compared to what we typically see over the last few months. So how are the Senate and the House getting information to inform their interim charges? Well, a couple of different approaches. The House has issued specific guidance that has laid out a couple of different ways that the committees can get public input. For the most part, most of the committees are going with essentially an RFI, a request for information. And what that looks like is essentially people submit written testimony that will be posted on a public website. And that's what we can expect. We've got two different water-related charges that have RFIs outstanding right now. The House Natural Resources Committee has issued an RFI for all of its 4 charges, and we'll walk through those in just a second. And the House Appropriations Committee has issued one related to dam infrastructure. And so those are the 2 that are outstanding right now. On the Senate side, the Senate had already had a public hearing in January. It's hard to believe that was still this year. It's been a long year, but they have already gotten input on almost all of their charges. So they're able to use that information, and they're doing some emails to specific stakeholders where they need additional follow-up information. And that's what they're using to inform their interim charges. So moving into the House, they're looking at 4 different interim charges. The first one is a monitoring charge. You typically see this in every committee, but there is a notable groundwater issue that the House committee is monitoring, and that's House Bill 722 from last session about brackish groundwater production zones. So the notable thing here is that the Water Board is currently undertaking rulemaking for the groundwater production zones. Last week in the TWCA Groundwater Committee, which I'll go into later, we had a discussion about this because there are some folks that have some interest in creating some, now that the Water Board has established those groundwater production zones, there are some who have had additional science and want to potentially make changes to those zone boundaries. And so one of the things that we've been encouraging our stakeholders to do is if you have questions about those zone boundaries, now might be a good time to submit comments to the Water Development Board to ask them to consider creating a process for amending those groundwater production zones. If you're interested in doing that, the Water Board's deadline for their rule comments is September the 21st. The second big interim charge is about water supply. It is a very large charge that encompasses a lot of different things, right? This charge can go into surface water and groundwater, it goes into infrastructure and infrastructure gaps, goes into water planning, it goes into markets. And it also goes into an issue that at TWCA, we've been spending a lot of time on this interim, and that's wholesale rate appeals. And what that is it's an appeal process at the Public Utility Commission for wholesale water and wastewater. Now, this can apply to wholesale sellers and purchasers of groundwater, but for the most part, these conversations in the previous cases have been focused much more on surface water. The third interim charge is very specific to groundwater. So joint planning, DFCs, we know all about that. We're wrapping up the third round of DFCs, and there have been substantial changes as we've moved through each round of developing those DFCs. So the committee is really looking for input on how has this last round been going? What are you seeing? Are there opportunities to streamline or simplify that process? How can we make that better and achieve our goals? And lastly, we have a charge about the state auditor's review. Now, the types of audits that we're talking about here that fall under the committee's jurisdiction are going to be the groundwater audits, which you all are very familiar with. You know, it's looking at whether or not those groundwater districts that are selected for the audit have achieved their management plan goals and those statutory requirements. But it's also any audits of the Water Development Board. There's another charge that I want to point out here, and it's a joint charge for the House Ways and Means and Energy Resources Committee, and it's focused on produced water and how we can incentivize use of produced water. So because we have all this excess water, we've got to figure out another way to use it, because there are limitations on continuing to put that water into injection wells because of some geologic issues and potential for earthquakes. So while this charge is really geared at using tax credits or other means to incentivize folks to recycle and reuse that water in the oil and gas industry, I don't know that tax credits really have the best chance of passing this session just because of the budget issues, but never say never. Groundwater districts, though, would be wise to keep this on their radar, because if you're talking about more produced water recycled in the oil business, that has implications for demand for groundwater, because it's essentially replacing groundwater. And that's a key source of revenue near the oil fields. And I know that you guys had a session on produced water as water supply yesterday. And as you know, it does have the potential for other uses. Specifically, I think there are some folks looking at how much you can use for irrigation, especially for those agricultural interest near the Permian. So as soon as the economics make sense on that, that's going to be something that will change things. On the Senate side, we also have a very large water supply charge, but in this one, we have a little bit more insight into what the Senate is thinking, because they've had a public hearing on this charge. In January, the Senate was very focused on looking into produced water as an additional water supply option. Senator Perry expressed some concern that there's not enough urgency in developing the new water supplies that we're going to need to meet growing demands. Because as you know, the Texas population continues to grow in outsized ways compared to other states. And he also had a lot of questions about reservoirs. As we all know, it takes a very long time and is very difficult to permit those new reservoirs, and it can take decades. And so his questions are really about, we have all of these reservoirs on the books. Is it really the best approach for us in meeting our future water supply? Or should we be looking at some of these other alternative sources like produced water, like brackish water, which are the main groundwater related charges or sources there. For produced water, you know, I think the bottom line here when you're talking about it as a water supply is that it really just needs to be more cost effective for produced water to be able to be used for wider sources. The economics are generally there, as I said, for the oil and gas recycling. But when you start talking about some of the things that we've seen in other states, like using it for irrigation, and then moving forward into how do we discharge that into state waterways and or transfer that into a drinking water purpose, you've got a lot of big discussions that are going to be coming down the pike as far as what kind of water quality standards it will take and how we set that up at the state level in order to permit those discharges. So the groundwater regulatory framework, again, this is very similar to what we see in the House. You know, they also covered this in the January hearing. There are a lot of questions, continued questions about attorney fees. as well as, perspectives from those property right owners, and then monitoring the agencies and programs. So what can you expect this fall? Well, the House and Senate committee staff are working on their interim reports covering the charges that we just discussed. They're digesting information, they're gathering more information, and so they'll be publishing those reports this fall, and that will probably lead into and give some hints about the types of bills that they'll be filing for the next session. As you cannot avoid election season, right? We're in it now. The elections are November 3rd. There's a lot of questions about what that political party makeup is going to be in the House and the Senate. Is there going to be, which party is going to win, and how big is that majority going to be? And as soon as we have those elections and have an idea about what that makeup is going to look like, then we're going to move into the speaker race. So as soon as we have that election, we'll have a better feel for what kinds of majorities and coalitions will need to be formed in order to get a speaker elected. And of course, bill pre-filing will begin on the Monday after the election. So what does next session look like? Well, a lot of questions about that. I put this slide up about Sunset just because they have started down this path. I call them the canary in the coal mine because the House and Senate rules, as we discussed, don't allow for video conferencing, but Sunset is not subject to the House or Senate rules because it's a joint committee. They can make their own rules. So Sunset staff worked for months with the House and Senate parliamentarians to think through what could a public hearing process look like that could incorporate public testimony through virtual means. Thought they had agreement. They get into this hearing, and at the last minute, the Senate Republicans decided that they weren't in favor of what they thought they had agreed to. So you saw that the House seemed pretty inclined towards an approach that would accommodate virtual testimony. The Senate Republicans really were focused on something that would be a in-person process, which just had some complicating factors that they're still trying to work out, right? So if you have to maintain social distancing and you have to find facilities that can accommodate that kind of public testimony, because Sunset's a very public-focused process, that just creates a few challenges. They've been going back and forth. They set a hearing that was going to be only written testimony, no oral testimony, no physical testimony. Then they canceled that meeting, and they continue to debate that, and they have not set another hearing, and so that debate continues. They're now months behind on their interim work at this point, which is perhaps not a really great sign of how next session is going to go. You've got these debates about virtual and in-person and masks, and it's just very politicized. And so despite the logistics, it's that political angle that is going to create some tension. Again, what does it look like? A lot of uncertainty. The good thing is, from a logistical perspective, there's been plenty of time to research what can this look like? How can we accommodate public testimony, bring people in, let them participate in the process? The bad thing is the politics are probably going to be where this falls apart. So we've heard a lot of different things. We've heard that they're going to come in, they're going to call a session to order, and then they could immediately break and everybody goes home. Or we come in and we work for a while, maybe there's an outbreak, and then everybody goes home to sort of let things die down and let that outbreak pass. We've heard things about, will there be health screenings outside of the Capitol, which is like temperature checks before you come in, asking if you have symptoms. We've heard, could it be written testimony only? Could the House think about maybe options for video testimony? A lot of discussion about how do you minimize the number of people that are going to be in the Capitol, because that's just more chances to spread infection. For example, a lot of places in the Capitol, they'll rent out public spaces during the session. Maybe that's not the greatest idea. A lot of local governments, counties and cities will come and have, Gillespie County Day at the Capitol. Maybe it's not the best session to go and do that, because I think some of the members and staffs are looking at these big groups coming to the Capitol as, I think Brian Sledge calls them potential COVID vectors, right? You've got people that could have COVID that are roaming from office to office to office, and you can only take one to be a super spreader, and you don't know what that's going to look like, and that could be risky. It could be only appointments to see your legislator or their staff in their offices. So there's a lot of different ideas floating around, and we'll see. The other piece of it is the uncertain politics, right? Our speaker, we're going to have a new speaker. We know this. We're going to know more about who that speaker is and see that race unfold late this fall after the election. Depending on who the speaker is, that could change who chairs our committee. So, for example, Representative Larson, perhaps he's in a different role. Maybe he's not chairing water anymore. It's really hard to tell. Same with the budget. It's going to be very difficult. And typically when you have a new speaker come in, you don't see committee chairs named until a little bit later in the process, mid to late February, which delays the start. And new people in power means different priorities that might be considered. So there's a lot at play with the speaker race. So spoiler alert, it's not going to be a groundwater session. So I've put in some additional slides to just talk about some of these other issues, especially the budget, because it's going to take up a lot of the session time. These are generally what you're going to see. You're going to have, you've got a hole in the budget. We're running a budget deficit this year. How are we going to get past that? There's a lot of discussion about COVID, not only dealing with the current outbreak that we have, but planning and getting ourselves positioned for if we have something like this occurring again or a resurgence. Redistricting, which comes about every 10 years. And then, as you know, the police reform and the racial injustice has really been brewing, and it's likely to be a top priority, especially for Democrats. For these reasons, TWCA is not looking to bring a robust agenda to the legislature. So a little on the budget, we're down 10% in our sales tax, and our oil and gas revenue tanked largely because of the drop in demand related to COVID, but also we had some tension with Saudi Arabia and Russia that has really impacted that revenue coming into the state. Now we have started to recover as we had that big dip right after COVID hit, and it is starting to come back up. People are still online shopping, people are still getting out there. A lot of home repair happening, for example. Our GR, the latest numbers from Comptroller Hager, we were looking at a surplus this year of a couple $1 billion, and now we're looking at about 11.5 billion less. So it's a pretty significant change. And even just for this current budget year, we're looking at a deficit of about 4.6 billion. And so that's going to be difficult to make up. Now, these numbers do not account for a couple of things that have been happening. First, the state leadership has asked for agencies to implement a 5% cut. And so any savings that the state is getting there are not a part of these numbers. We've also gotten significant COVID relief funding from the federal government. And that's really helped to offset some of the increased costs across various functions of government. So that's really been helping us. The other kinds of budget concerns that you'll probably see, health and education are the two sectors of our budget that we spend the most money on. So those are going to be huge focuses. The things we have to talk about there are Medicaid program is typically not funded fully in the budget. They will fund it through the first, fiscal year and a half till about January, February when we get back into the session. And then the legislature typically comes in and passes a supplemental bill that gives them the rest of their money to continue out that year. And just to put that in perspective, when we came into the last session, that was about $4.2 billion. So that's a significant amount of money. We're also looking at probably a reduced federal match in the Medicaid program, which is going to require an increase in state costs. On the education side, the legislature spent a lot of time reforming this school finance system last session. We had this situation where instead of the state and locals being 50-50 in how they pay for the school finance program, you had it where local growth would go like this and the locals were giving much more than the state, and it kept getting off kilter. So they fixed that last time, which is really great for local governments in your school districts, but it does require that the state has to put in a little bit more money to keep maintaining that because you're not having that local growth supplement the state share anymore. So that's something that we need to look at moving forward. Education is incredibly important. This legislature made a really great move putting more money into that. It's just a question about how you sustain that, because oil and gas money really helped us do that last time. And so if we don't have that money, we've got to find another source. So, how are we going to plug this hole? Well, practically speaking, this is from the comptroller's office, legislature only has control over about 10% of the budget. And what I mean by that is that when you take out federal funds, which there are strings about how we spend that money and how the state money that is matching that is spent, you have constitutional restrictions, you have court restrictions, you have pre-existing funding formulas, and all of those things sort of guide how a lot of our money is spent. So we've got a rainy day fund, and that's really great. Texas is so much better positioned than so many other states, but 8.8 billion, it's a lot of money, you know, but when you have a $250 billion budget, it's really just over 3.5% or so. So it's not gonna be the only option. You're gonna see a hunt for new money. It might be in the form of existing fees, creation of new fees, increases in those fees, maybe a look at tax exemptions and exclusions. Budget tricks are always fun, but super helpful because it's a way for us to meet all of the constitutional requirements without hurting our state so much. So for example, these are the things like pushing a payment one day into the next fiscal year, or freezing money in dedicated accounts, money that is supposed to be for a purpose, and not spending it so it's there so it helps certify the budget. In budget cuts, you can expect us to try and defend any cuts to Water Board and TCEQ, especially when you're talking about GAMS, WAMS, and science and data. COVID-19, these are sort of a list of things that we've all heard about and been seeing over the last several months. Data, of course, you know, privacy is a big deal. We all know about HIPAA. HIPAA was actually put in place to help facilitate sharing of data, and it's kind of done the opposite. So there are a lot of questions about it. We're not really designed for a real-time data system, so we've got to figure out a way to do that. Public health response, you know, Texas is great at responding to emergencies. We have a really great system in place. How do we take those lessons that we know about and that we do really well and put that into a public health and planning perspective? I think our pandemic plan was probably a little dusty coming into this. A lot of questions, right, about state versus local authority. This is a continuing debate about local control, really. And you've got some questions there about even who's in control during a pandemic within the state. You've got the governor, you've got emergency management, and you've got your public health officials. So just probably some clarifications there. Schools and daycare is going to be a big one. Anybody who is a parent knows that this is an incredibly emotional debate where parents feel like they're having to choose between their child's health and their academics. And that's a really difficult position. So I expect to see a lot of discussion about that. Making some of these exceptions that we've been having during COVID permanent. For example, the video conferences, some of the open meetings changes, I think that we haven't seen a lot of downsides to that. Maybe we should be doing that, you know, on a normal basis, allowing that. And of course, probably the best part of this whole pandemic, because you have to find your silver linings where you can, margaritas to go have been a huge success, and I don't think anybody opposes keeping this forever. I sure hope not. The other stuff that might come up, right, supply chain, regulatory issues, inequities. Redistricting is the other one that I wanted to cover before I get into water. You know, the rumor is that there might be some hearings on this before the end of the year, so we'll see. We're going to be watching that. Back in April, whenever COVID first hit, Census Bureau asked the Trump administration to give them a little bit more time to put all that data out. Right now, the data is supposed to come to the states by April the 1st to allow, and it's usually coming in a few weeks before that. And that has been great because it allows our legislature to get the redistricting done during the session. Now, if that data comes in on time or perhaps a little bit later, maybe even the end of July, like the Census Bureau had initially requested, then we may have to come into special session to get that done. There are some constitutional issues there because the Constitution requires the legislature to adopt those maps in their first regular session. You could see some efforts to maybe amend the Constitution to allow us to adopt them within any session, not just a regular session. So for example, a special session. And on to water. So it's not going to be a groundwater session, but that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be groundwater bills that come up. A lot of things, you know, we've been talking about them already, the ones that are likely to come back. In January, the Senate was talking about attorney fees. I expect that to come back. I understand that the petition for groundwater district rulemaking is going to come back. I don't know about the similar rule, same aquifer, but I would not be surprised to see that again. Produced water will continue to be a topic because, again, we've got to figure out something to do with that water. Oil and gas is incredibly important to this state, as we talked about with the budget. We're very blessed to have it, but we've got to find some way to use that water because we can't keep injecting it. And a little about our TWCA Groundwater Committee. So we met for the first time this interim last week. Again, our mission at TWCA is very focused first on building consensus, because with it, TWCA represents so many different water stakeholders, and getting us all into the same room and talking about the impacts and helping negotiate that change is a really important part of what TWCA does. Part of that process, again, is educating not only our own members, but also members of the legislature. And then the smallest part of what we do is advocacy. And so when we have consensus bills that come out of Groundwater Committee, that's something that we will be advocating for at the Capitol. The consensus process, again, Groundwater Committee has led the charge on this for well over 10 years, has a really great reputation for having the stakeholders drive the change. A lot of times, they're in response to major issues at the Capitol, things that have been contentious for several sessions that the committee will take up and try to work through. While we have over 100 participants, I think the list serves closer to 150 at this point. So a lot of participation, almost all the stakeholders that you need are going to be at the table. And for anything to come out of that committee and for TWCA to get behind it at the Capitol, it has to have at least 90% consensus coming out of that committee. And so we take that very seriously in trying to work through something that works for all of the stakeholders. In the late spring, we surveyed our committee members and said, what's on your mind? What do you think the committee should take up this time? And this is just sort of a big list of the kinds of ideas that were out there. There are a couple of these that you see are pretty big issues, joint planning process, DFC appeals, that's all related in the same bucket. It's a big deal. Some of the discussion on here and then as well in our committee discussion is about fees. So just that comes down right to groundwater districts and how they're funded. But for the most part, what you see here is bite-sized chunks of things that we think we can really work through and get consensus. And that's great because this session, we're hearing a lot about don't come to the Capitol if you've got a bunch of bills that are controversial. If we've got so little time, we've got big things, budget, COVID, right, redistricting, these things that we've really got to focus on. We don't have the time to take up these things unless they're really pressing matters, unless you're all on the same page, or unless they're truly local bills, right? Outside of that, the legislature is not looking to have a robust agenda. So I think that this list is workable. And during that committee meeting, we ended up deciding to consider the following. So you'll see a couple of these are things from last session, and then towards the bottom of the list, we don't know how far we're going to make progress on this idea of waste and whether water that's released through a bed and banks permit is considered waste or not, and some mitigation type discussions, but it's something that we're going to try. And it's always good to try and reach consensus and to get us closer together as stakeholders, because it sets us up for resolving these issues. If not this session, then maybe the next one. And we've got a couple other things out there that we're still getting some additional information on. So what else could impact groundwater districts? At first we talked a little about the meeting flexibility, right? Making some of these exceptions, OMA's Open Meetings Act, making them permanent, maybe allowing teleconferencing on a longer basis. The prohibition on lobbying with public funds, that's a big one for a lot of groundwater districts. It is for us at TWCA. There are those that argue that kind of a prohibition on lobbying with public funds really can impact rural governments, because it's harder for them to have the resources to have a full-time in-house GR person that can sit and watch what's happening at the Capitol. They hire lobbyists as a way to maintain that voice, and otherwise there are some concerns about rural communities' ability to influence and provide input into their government. The water board budget, of course, that's where a lot of groundwater science and data is there, so we'll be watching that. And TDLR sunset, I mentioned, it's not, the report that came out doesn't have any substantive impacts really to water well drillers, but it might be wise to just keep an eye on that bill in case there's something in there about dealing with abandoned wells. And the reason why is, while abandoned wells, the bigger issue, I think as most of us know, is a money issue. And that's not going to happen this session. But the theme of the TDLR Sunset report was this agency has growing pains because they've absorbed all of these programs, but not necessarily gotten all the money to support them. And they're struggling to do everything that they do well. The strength of TDLR is they have a functional model where they do licensing and they do enforcement, and there are a lot of efficiencies you can gain here. But things like abandoned wells kind of stick out as one of those weird one-off things. So if you see somebody try and streamline TDLR's model, that could be something that comes up. Now, I mean, I don't know that it's wrong to move that or not. You would, if it's not at TDLR, and what we're talking about here is just capping wells in white areas, because groundwater districts have the responsibility for that in any place where a groundwater district exists. So it's just the white areas. You know, TDLR has the expertise because they regulate the standards for putting in a well, right? Drilling a well. TCEQ has expertise, especially from the water quality standpoint, and whether or not that deterioration is causing problems. I think TCEQ will always be the agency to resolve any sort of actual water quality complaints, but it's hard to separate to decide which of those agencies is the most appropriate agency, because it could probably be done in either place. I mean, when you have a bad well, is it because it's deteriorated, or is it because it wasn't put in to the standards in the first place? And so sometimes that's hard to get out of. So those are the things to watch for. And that's it. And I will be happy to take any questions.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was great. You answered, some questions came in, and over the course of that fantastic presentation, you answered pretty much all of them. It was incredibly informative and thorough. There was one question that came in, and it went to that last slide you put up that I would maybe pose to you before you come off, and it goes to that. It goes to the issue of local control. And the question was, you know, kind of the issue of local control seems like it's mostly one about the state fighting the cities in Texas, but GCDs on some of these issues can get caught up in that. What are your thoughts on that? And I'm thinking like the lobbying with public funds in particular might be an example of that.
Yeah, so there were several versions of that bill and that approach last time. So it's hard to know how broad that net is going to be captured. I think, to your point, most of the consternation at the state level is towards cities and municipal governments, but there are, I mean, clearly groundwater districts, river authorities, so many special districts have lobbyists that are coming and representing their interests. And so it's very easy for us to be caught up in that net. You know, from a water perspective, I don't really see lobbying as inappropriate, because as anybody knows who's gotten into water law, especially groundwater law, it's so technical, it's so antiquated. You know, it's important to have legal resources that can translate that to us to make sure that we are all on the same page about the impacts that can go in there. And, you know, so much of it is driven by the law as opposed to agency rules, that it is important to have, you know, your interests represented, and to be somebody who understands it well enough that they'll be able to advocate for different interests. And so, you know, it really just depends how broad that fight is going to be. You know, in the city of Austin, we have this whole thing right now about defunding the police, which some people say that happened. It was $150 million. And then the mayor saying, well, it was only 20 million. And the other stuff is just moving stuff around. And you've seen the governor respond. And so you're starting to see that rhetoric amp up again. So I anticipate this discussion is going to happen for sure. But we'll be watching that and be keeping you guys in the loop about what's happening.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Sarah. Like I said, that was great. Really appreciate it.